This is really getting crazy now, and it's not good for Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin crash continues, and Bitcoin keeps falling further down. We even have an emergency announcement here, and Donald Trump is going for maximum pain. He says there will be reciprocal tariffs on all countries. This is an absolute shocker. It was still expected that there might be certain exceptions here. I had already recorded the whole video. Then this shocking news came out. The Japanese stock market also immediately sold off massively. We now have to watch very closely how the market reacts and whether there will be further sell-offs once the markets open. And then Bitcoin could also be dragged down with it. But first, let's watch the video I recorded earlier because things are really escalating here. And what's happening right now should not be underestimated. Donald Trump just had a tense conversation with Putin and is very upset. Massive tariffs are now being threatened and the trade war could escalate. That's according to the Kobasi letter. There are even voices talking about a potential third world war and hyperinflation. Donald Trump is even threatening a bombing attack. We need to look into this because the situation is really threatening to escalate now. The Bitcoin price is still holding up relatively well, even with this potential escalation looming over us. We are now in the trading week of reciprocal tariffs, meaning the current mutual tariffs that are coming our way this week. And it continues to intensify, and it increasingly looks like we won't have a de-escalation here on April 2nd. But rather everything is building up towards an escalation. I think it should be clear that if the trade war continues to escalate and potentially even turns into a hot war, this whole situation is not good for Bitcoin and the general financial markets. I mean, at the moment, nothing has really happened yet. At the moment, there's still a lot of hot air. Donald Trump is making a lot of, let's say, big statements. He's boasting a lot and so on. We're looking at all of this step by step now. Donald Trump is even threatening with secondary tariffs, meaning countries that, for example, trade with Russia, Venezuela, or countries that the USA doesn't like will also face problems and be sanctioned. So, this is really the ultimate shocker, what's happening here. But before we look at all the details, let's take a look at the conversation between Donald Trump and Putin. There's a reporter who actually has a leak and is talking about the conversation on TV. And it's really shocking what is being revealed here.
Just hours ago, President Trump called me to tell me he is, quote, pissed off with Russia's President Putin and threatened to impose secondary tariffs on Russia's oil. Quote, if Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, but if I think it was Russia's fault, I am going to put secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia. Mr. Trump said 25% tariffs on Russian oil could happen any moment and told me he plans to speak with President Putin this week. The president told me, quote, I was very angry, pissed off when Putin started getting into Zelensky's credibility and started talking about new leadership in Ukraine.
Also, the reporter says here that she spoke with Donald Trump on the phone and that Donald Trump is really pissed off. He is now threatening with secondary tariffs, which means you have to consider this. This means it primarily affects oil. This means anyone who does business with Russia is potentially liable or will be punished. And we just need to know countries that deal with Russia include North Korea, Iran, China, Saudi Arabia, and so on. And these countries could now also be sanctioned by Donald Trump, and this could really lead to an escalation. I mentioned at the very beginning potential hyperinflation and a third world war. That was the first comment on it from Meet Kevin, one of the largest finance channels here in the USA. I mean, clearly the statement is a bit exaggerated, but we are still seeing movements here that can change everything geopolitically. And the same thing he's doing with Russia, he's also doing with Venezuela. He says here, we are not buying oil from Venezuela, and countries that are now making any deals with Venezuela, he apparently wants to punish them too, even with secondary tariffs. Then we see a trend reversal here. Suddenly, Zelensky is now the good guy, not Putin. That means Donald Trump was always very, very good with Putin. Now suddenly, because Putin wanted to start negotiating over some territories in Ukraine or something like that, here, Donald Trump has now said, no, he is now overriding Zelensky's sovereignty. Now he sees Putin very, very critically again, and is now more on Zelensky's side. That means we are seeing massive shifts here, and Donald Trump says that massive tariffs could come at any time, 25% tariffs could come on oil and so on. And oil is simply, I would say, the water that holds the global markets together, a very, very important resource globally. And this can have massive impacts on the markets. This is a very, very inflationary game that is currently taking place, which can massively drive prices up, but can also lead to a lot of unrest, because a trade war can sooner or later turn into an active war, even though it might still be far off. But Donald Trump is now making statements like threatening to bomb Iran and imposing secondary tariffs if the country does not reach an agreement on its nuclear program with the USA. He is also threatening tariffs of 25 to 50% on Russian oil if there is no agreement to end the Ukraine war. So that's basically the next threat. That means Donald Trump has promised he will end the war here in a few days. And now he seems to be escalating because the war isn't ending as quickly as expected.
I could do so much. I'll give you an example. When I said I could fix this war in Ukraine in 24 hours, but you can only do it from the presidential seat. You can't do it. Let's say he sent me over as an emissary. You can't do it. You have to be in that position.
You have to be the guy.
I would fix that within 24 hours. And if I win, before I get into the office, I will have that war settled. 100% sure.
Well, I mean, of course, it's not that easy to create peace negotiations here, but at the moment it looks more like escalation. We'll also get into what Kobe writes about this, because he is expecting a total escalation that is coming our way next week. Here is another interesting report from CNBC where it also says, where Donald Trump then says, no, not from CNBC, but from NBC, where it says Donald Trump couldn't care less if automakers raise car prices in response to the planned tariffs on auto imports, meaning the auto imports where Donald Trump also wants to impose tariffs. And now Donald Trump makes a statement and says, hey, I don't give a damn if prices go up here. I don't give a damn if the stock markets go down. He didn't say that exactly, but he implied it differently. I don't give a damn if Bitcoin goes down, the stock markets. I don't care at all. I'm going through with my plan. No matter what happens with the stock markets, what happens with car prices, even if it later leads to high inflationary phases to hyperinflationary phases. I mean, hyperinflation is already a very strong term, but it's very, very concerning what's going on here. There is a very, very interesting assessment from Walter Bloomberg, who says that Barclays currently assumes that the mutual tariffs imposed by President Trump on April 2nd will affect up to 25 countries. The U.S. sectors likely to be affected include the automotive, pharmaceutical, and semiconductor industries. On Friday, President Trump said that tariffs on pharmaceuticals will soon be introduced as part of the recent escalation. So we see that it's not just a small region that's affected, but it's truly a global event that's approaching us. We were promised that on April 2nd, everything will clear up, and then capital will return to the stock market. There will be a shift from a risk-off sentiment to a risk-on sentiment, leading to more risk-taking investments and so on. But now it looks more like on April 2nd, the situation will escalate even further, and we will move into an even more extreme risk-off sentiment, with even less risk capital entering the market. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Donald Trump can change his mind at any time. But that's currently the issue, which is why it's very, very difficult for Bitcoin to achieve significant price gains at the moment. And unfortunately, Kobeisai had a very, very good analysis here. He has always analyzed everything related to the trade wars quite well in the past. This is simply about April 2nd again, and the market is actually assessing it as Liberation Day. That's also what Donald Trump is saying about Liberation Day and so on. However, the Kobeisai letter assumes that while the markets view this day as one where uncertainty decreases, we believe that the exact opposite will be the case. Here you can also see the uncertainty in the market represented in a chart. Here, the 3-month average of the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. I'm not exactly sure how it's measured, to be honest, but in any case, we see that it is currently spiking significantly. We see that the last time there was such great uncertainty in the market was during the pandemic phase. It also becomes very clear here that we assume April 2nd will bring the biggest escalation of the trade war so far. The markets are facing a wild week, and one definitely needs to prepare for the possibility that this week could be rapid, could be volatile, and some very, very crazy things could happen, like Donald Trump coming up with some very, very crazy ideas, and all of this is very, very bad for the market. Uncertainty is always bad for the market. Certainty is always good for the market. That means you don't necessarily need positive news, but at least a certain level of planning security, because no major capital is going to invest massive billions into any market where it's unclear what will happen next, what Donald Trump will do, whether we will return to a risk-on sentiment or remain in a risk-off sentiment. Then there are the central banks, where it's also uncertain what direction they will take, how many interest rate cuts we will see this year, and what's currently happening. That means the market first needs to regain some security here, and Donald Trump is currently not providing us with that security at all. But it could really be the final trick to fully push the USA into a recession, to bring the USA into a complete economic catastrophe, or maybe catastrophe is an exaggeration, but to put them in a predicament so that the Federal Reserve finally lowers the interest rates. That might also be the big idea Donald Trump has behind all this uncertainty, that he is intentionally spreading the uncertainty here. However, I find it very, very strange if that really were Donald Trump's tactic, because he wouldn't just be throwing economic uncertainty into the mix, but he could potentially trigger a hot war. What he's doing here with bomb threats and introducing secondary tariffs, these are things that can really lead to active escalation, where one must be extremely careful. It's really not that easy to keep track of the whole situation anymore. Well, firstly, we now have 25% on steel and aluminum products from the USA. These are the US tariffs currently in force here. Then 25% on most Canadian goods, 10% on energy, 25% on all Mexican goods, 20% on many Chinese goods. The 25% tariffs on cars and 25% tariffs on countries that buy Venezuelan oil come into force this week. That means it will be very interesting. What I want to do with Venezuela, I also potentially want to do with Russia, that tariffs will be imposed on all countries that do deals with Russia. Now there are only tariffs on countries that make deals with Venezuela. Furthermore, it is stated here that Canada has already announced retaliatory tariffs on US goods worth $21 billion. China has imposed tariffs of 10 to 15% on US agricultural products, and the EU has also announced retaliatory tariffs. The Mexican president has already announced that he will announce retaliatory tariffs on April 3rd. So we can expect an escalation not only from Trump's side, but also from the other countries, and then Donald Trump could impose retaliatory tariffs on the retaliatory tariffs. It's quite crazy. Donald Trump imposes a tariff, then comes a retaliatory tariff, and then Donald Trump imposes a retaliatory tariff on the retaliatory tariff, and then there could be a retaliatory tariff on the retaliatory tariff on the retaliatory tariff, or maybe not. I mean, it's also a big poker game where maybe Donald Trump might make a concession again and so on, but it's definitely very, very intense what's happening right now, and you really need to check this out, this graphic. It's truly crazy. It says here that the consequence would be mutual tariffs on these tariffs and one of the biggest trade wars in history. With the tariffs announced this year is already around 8%, the highest since 1970. By the end of April, we expect that the high from 1946 will be surpassed. And here you can see that it is now expected that the high from 1946 will be surpassed. Here in the graph, you can see this very clearly in the US Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. Here is the 5-day moving average. Currently, the uncertainty is even higher than during the COVID period. We are higher than during Brexit. We are higher than, well, what else do we have here? Here, Iran was higher than during the Iran war in 2003. We are higher than in 2008 during the global financial crisis. We are higher than in most major crises in recent times. According to the index, we are even 80% higher than in 2008. I mean, the question is, how are such indices or indexes calculated? Is it relevant what the data here indicates? Or is it just something added up? We now definitely have several indicators, several indices that show massive uncertainty. Also the market, we see it in the prices. We don't have to look at any index. We can simply look at the stock markets, the Bitcoin price, and so on. We see the uncertainty reflected there as well. Let me know in the comments what you have planned for this week. Do you also see this as a very, very critical point or a very, very critical turning point? Do you think that salvation is coming now? Or do you think it will get much, much worse? I'll put a link down here. Here you can buy up all the dips if there are massive dips again. Here you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin with the code BitcoinHotel. Guys, see you until then. Peace out.